Hey guys, so we of course just had YCS Indianapolis, and I just want to do a huge shout out to Steven Santelli, of course, for winning the event with Rescue as a fellow Canadian. Also, speaking of fellow Canadian, another big shout out to Triff as well, who also finished top 4 with Mannadium. So as usual, I wanted to sort of go over the most played hand traps and staples in the topping list that were publicly available, and I think this is certainly exciting for me as well. It's post AGOV, and also I need to update my own deck list. And of course, before we continue, definitely go check out those discount codes, especially those Age of Overlord singles right now. Now, in terms of the topping deck lists that were available for this video, we had 24, and definitely a big shout out to YGOProDeck.com, a really good website for a lot of meta relevant resources. So of course, the pie chart would look a little bit different if we had all 32 lists available, but this is what we have to work with. And at the same time, we do still have Rescue Ace as the most represented deck, which we saw from YCS in the top 32, and also Purrely still up there, and a bit of a disappointing show from Tearlaments, I suppose. So now, to provide a quick overview of the hand traps, the median number of hand traps in the main deck was around 7, which is slightly higher than the 6 that we saw after YCS Dortmund when I did this breakdown. And now in terms of the side deck though, it was pretty much roughly the same as YCS Dortmund, but also more so from a historical average standpoint. Since I've been doing these breakdowns for the last couple of years, it's usually around 6. Now, in terms of going second, board breakers, and I'm including cards like even like Fenrir or even like Triple Tactics Talent as board breakers for the purpose of this breakdown, and it was by and large about the same as last time at YCS Tournament, which was around 5, and also in the side, that was also around 5 post YCS Tournament, but for Indianapolis it was a little bit lower at 4. And so in terms of like the number of hand traps in the side didn't really go up since the last time. Number of board breakers kind of went down, and I did notice in the side deck there were a lot of cards that were more so I guess quote unquote like deck core, or at least not a board breaker or a hand trap that were being seen play in the side more. Like, let's say for example Triff's side deck, he actually had like 3 extra deck monsters in the side, or let's say even cards like, I don't know, like Scattershot, or I've even seen like Keldor or Medora in non-Tearlament decks that were being played in the side, and those aren't really board breakers or hand traps. Now, in terms of the most common hand traps in the topping deck list that were publicly available, we still have Ashe at number 1. It's definitely the most generic of them all. Like Nibiru and Droll are very high impact, but I am finding that, like with most formats, like Nibiru is going to be good against certain decks, really bad against other decks, like let's say Thunder, and even like Droll, for example, is really impactful against, admittedly, a lot of decks, but sometimes it's just not that much high impact as well against others. So, what, if you want to kind of play it safe, at least in the main deck, sure, I think Ashe is definitely the best in terms of being able to hit every deck right now, and same can be said with Imperm, also very generic, and also can be good in terms of maybe shutting down a floodgate for a turn if you set it in the same column. We do have Nibiru. It is kind of like flipping back and forth nowadays. I mean, you know what? I think like Unchained is still around against Tearlaments. From my understanding, if you saw that Tearlaments survey video I did recently, I guess if they're not on the King of the Swamp package, I'm told that Nibiru can be a bit more impactful in that regard. Of course, you still have something like, let's say, Rescue Ace as well, which I'm sure the top players kind of expected that to be kind of like one of the better decks going into this new format, and Nibiru can also be impactful against that as well. We also have Droll, which was actually recently, post YCS Dortmund, saw an increase in play again, even though it kind of actually dropped off quite a bit since like YCS Vancouver, for example. But you know what, you have something like let's say Mannadium Triff topped, and I think there was another Mannadium list actually as well. So it can be really good against those strategies, because if you let Mannadium go first and you have no way to interrupt during their turn 1 board, I think it's pretty hard to break through that. So Droll definitely really key, and I think it is worthy of at least side decking right now. And then we of course have like the Bestials. We do have Druid's being played slightly higher than, let's say, the Magnum Nut, but of course, you know what, you're probably a lot of times playing both although Magnum Nut unfortunately is limited to 1, or maybe you could say fortunately, depending on what deck that you play. Still good against, let's say, something like Unchained, and you still had the Rise of Tearlaments, at least we thought, although of course at post YCS Indianapolis did not have as much top cut representation. And then we, of course, speaking of Tearlaments, of course, Shifter is a very good card against that strategy, and you were actually seeing a lot of different decks that were not Flunder, for example, that would still like side this card just for that, like let's say Tearlament matchup. You even saw like I noticed like, let's say, a Rika list playing this in the side, even though a lot of these decks cannot play optimally under Shifter. If it can play better than other decks that just completely die to it, and perhaps you still side it instead. You also have DD Crow, which has also been gaining popularity, even though we still have Bestials. DD Crow is still pretty unique in that it can also banish something like, let's say, spells or traps, which can certainly come up against something like a Purrely matchup, whereas Bestials really not that good against Purrely. And then you of course have something like Spooky Dogwood for that time win. So you know what, it definitely came up a lot during tier 0 format. I know I played this in my tier list back then. It was like honestly the best card I could ever hope for in terms of drawing. Post side can really unfortunately in the current time rules help you secure that win, because otherwise you're probably getting like 20,000 life points if your opponent just decides to go full in. And then we also have Lancia, which of course, only 2 of the 24 lists are available, so it's not a lot, but at the same time, the fact that it is at least seeing a bit of play, especially in the topping deck list, I think it's still something. I mean, it was definitely not seeing much play at all at least for the last little while. So in terms of the most common side deck staples, we of course have Feather Duster, no surprise, just blow up back row, really good against, pretty much anything. We also have Talents, which of course always goes hand in hand with Thrust, because Thrust can get you to Talents or just whatever other powerhouse spell or trap, and just kind of like blow things up from there, or whether you're going second or first. So, not much to say there. We also have Lightning Storm, so these 4 cards in order is actually the exact same as what we saw in YCS Dorman. So really generic cards and probably in most of your side deck lists. And then we also have Evenly Matched, which actually kind of saw a bit of a decline the last little bit or so, but you know what, it's still a really good card, I think. I mean, before, of course, you had something like, let's say, Unchained, which can still recover pretty well through an Evenly, and let's say with Purrely, they still get to keep the Noir, which is like the actual issue. But you know what, again, something like, let's say, like Rescue Ace is like the best deck, or at least one of the best decks right now, which if you can at least get through like the Omni Negate, I guess, it's still quite devastating. And also just a lot of other strategies, just kind of like the best generic board wipe there is. And then we saw Fenrir, which of course, Kashtira as a deck is not really like tier 1 anymore, but you know what, Fenrir, you're still gonna see a lot of play. I don't know how this is still at 3. I suspect it will get put to 1 at some point, because so many deck lists are playing it, and it's just like a really, really insane card, whether going first or second. We also have Xyz Encore, which we didn't see as much. Last time we actually saw more Herald of the Abyss, because obviously it's something that you can get your access to through Thrust. But you know what, Xyz Encore is still quite good, especially being able to out that Purrely Noir. And also, speaking of quick plays, we do also have Droplet, which with the Rise Art being gone, we kind of expected to see a bit more play. I think I'm not really sure if people expected the Rescue Ace list, the post Age of Overlord, to play Ibly. I know they are certainly capable of doing it, but from what I saw for the topping deck list, I don't think they were actually on Ibly. But I guess if there were, Droplet is an easy way to get rid of that, and also being able to negate your opponent's monster as well. We also have Solemn Judgment, just generic, just being able to stop pretty much about anything. And then I guess there's actually a new trap that was announced that was sort of like another iteration of Solemn Judgment in a sense. We also have Herald of the Abyss, which I had briefly talked about, which can help you just out that Purrely Noir, but you know what, it's a little bit more generic than Xyz Encore at least. And then we also have Pancratop seen in a few lists, pretty generic, can just pop pretty much any card, and also a pretty big attack to boot. And then Super Poly, this one's kind of interesting because we didn't actually see many branded lists topping, and yet we still see Super Poly in these non-branded lists. And of course, you have something like, let's say, a Mannadium, and just being able to, if you play Draco Exquisite as your Super Poly target, you can just out that, Barone and like Savage, or even, let's say, Dispatter. So it can certainly be pretty good in this current format, but I think it more so depends on the deck that you're playing, and especially, you do need a bit of a flexible extra deck. And then we have Book of Eclipse, which has certainly been seeing a decline in play lately, this as well as Book of Moon. You don't have a Rise Art anymore, so it's not really as necessary, but you know what, it's still pretty solid, especially because at least this one does not target. And again, something like Tearlaments, especially if you are able to go through like an Omni Negate, it can definitely be useful, especially because it can also shut down something like, let's say, the Sulik. And then you have D-Barrier, which fortunately is not seeing as much play this time around. Hopefully this trend kind of continues and sort of doesn't see much play anymore. Obviously it's very, very good against something like Purrely, and I mean branded, sure, but as you saw in YCS Indie Top Cut Breakdown, not as much branded this time around. And this is a card that, I think a lot of people want it banned, and hopefully it does end up on that spot, but at least for now, if it's not seeing that much play, I'll definitely take that. You also have Call by the Grave, pretty generic, but definitely has also seen a lot of decline in play in the last little while. Now, in terms of tech choices, there's a few. Definitely there were other cards like, let's say, like Spellbound or Magic Deflector, which I already covered in a previous YCS Top Cut Breakdown video, so I thought I'd try to cover something new. We had a few cards here that we'll kind of briefly go over each one. The first one was Scrubbed Raid, which was actually seen in that Runic list, so it was kind of funny, like during the battle phase, you can send a card, you control the graveyard, except this one, and then just end the battle phase. I originally, when I first saw the card, read the card rather, I thought, why not just play something like Threatening Roar, but then I realized it's a continuous trap, so okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. So I thought it was pretty funny to see this. And definitely, if you want some other singles, go check out Tier 0 Games or Card Brawlers and use my code Hakuna5 for 5% off. And another card that was seen in just one list is Soul Drain, and so this is a card that where monsters that are banished or in the graveyard cannot activate their effects, which of course can be pretty good against Tearlaments. Definitely did see a little bit of play during that tier 0 format, and I guess it can also hit Flunder too because those monsters are banished. One thing with Soul Drain though, from my experience playing this card in the past, is that a lot of times you're kind of like forced to like shotgun this card a little bit, just because essentially, let's say for example your opponent activates a monster effect in the graveyard and then you chain Soul Drain as Chainlink 2. That Chainlink 1 effect, whatever it was, it will still resolve. It's not like let's say a Skill Drain where your opponent, summons a monster, activates effect, you use Skill Drain, and then that effect gets negated. So essentially Soul Drain just prevents them from activating the effect, but if it already activated and then you chain this, that first effect, it's still gonna resolve. So it does kind of reveal where Soul Drain is located, for example, which can get sniped by something like, let's say, Cosmic Cyclone, but that's just a little side note. And then lastly, we have Necro Valley, which actually saw play in at least in one of the lists I topped. It was in the Rika list. Of course, this is something that we also saw play in Tearlament format just to prevent them from being able to move out of the graveyard. But one side note about this card as well is something like, let's say, Bestial Lubellion, that can actually still special summon from the graveyard under Necro Valley, so just keep that in mind. Alright guys, so that was it for the breakdown of the most played hand traps and staples for YCS Indianapolis. Hopefully that was helpful in helping you prepare your side deck for whatever events that you may have coming up. Definitely a huge thanks to all of you for watching the video. Huge thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel, and well, take care guys.